Hey guys, finding the perfect gift for the food lover in your life is easy, thanks to Goldbelly. Goldbelly ships America's most iconic foods, straight from world-famous restaurants right to your door. So if you want to treat someone to Joe's Stone Crab from Miami, Franklin Barbecue from Texas, or desserts from famous foodies like Ina Garten or Martha Stewart, Goldbelly has you covered. Just go to goldbelly.com and for a limited time, get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT. That's promo code GIFT.
Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to retired Air Force Major General Charlie Dunlap, the executive director of the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security at Duke University Law School, about whether the Trump administration's strikes against alleged drug boats are legal and whether the president has reached the legal limit of how he can use the U.S. military domestically. And then we break down the high-stakes meeting between President Trump and Chinese President Xi, the latest backlash against Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and whether a Netflix movie is playing a crucial role in the national debate about the Golden Dome missile shield. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times. My esteemed co-host Guy Taylor is off this week, so I'm here solo, but the good news for listeners is we have an extended interview with Charlie Dunlap from Duke University coming up in just a few minutes, and we really do a deep dive into all of the legal questions swirling around the Trump administration's war against alleged narco-terrorists in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, and whether there's any kind of solid legal framework at this point for the administration potentially going even further than that and trying to topple the regime of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, which the administration says is the driving force behind a lot of the drugs being funneled into the United States. And just this week, of course, we had multiple strikes against those alleged drug boats, more people killed, and still not a lot of answers really from the administration on how exactly it's determining who these people are, what they're carrying on these boats. So we'll get into all that in just a few minutes. Stay tuned for that. But first things first, as always, President Trump met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in South Korea just a few hours before I recorded this on Thursday afternoon. And Trump cast the meeting as a huge success. And it does seem to have produced some real tangible benefits, not the least of which is that China has delayed for 1 year export controls, restrictions on rare earth elements. You probably remember we've done a few deep dives on this show into rare earths, which are crucial components of modern technology, everything from phones and TVs to fighter jets. But China dominates the world in the processing of those elements. They control 90%, perhaps more, of the processing capacity globally, and that was becoming a real leverage point for communist China. If they were to cut off those elements from the US or our allies in Europe, for example, that's a big deal. And it's a win for the Trump administration that, at least for now, that seems to have been taken off of the table. In return, Trump is lowering tariffs on Chinese goods by 10%. There are some other details here in this agreement, including Chinese promises to buy American soybeans. I'd encourage you to go read our coverage at the Washington Times to get some more detail on the nuts and bolts of all of this. But for me personally, I was just once again struck by President Trump's leader-to-leader diplomacy and the way in which that remains his preferred method of getting things done. We've seen it with Xi, with Russian President Vladimir Putin, albeit without a lot of real tangible success. We've seen it on the positive side recently with Ukrainian President Zelensky, and on the negative side earlier this year during their disastrous Oval Office meeting. You can go all the way back to Trump's first term when he struck a deal with Chuck and Nancy, if you remember, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, after meeting with them personally and seeming to develop something of a personal rapport with those congressional Democrats. That rapport, of course, did not last very long. But still, it's another example of Trump's preference to get face-to-face, leader-level diplomacy, direct engagement, even with people you disagree with. He's open to meeting again, by the way, with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. So we could see more of this, I think, coming perhaps in the not too distant future. But speaking of leaders here, there's more to discuss about Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. My colleague John Seward and I did some exclusive reporting this week into a new memo from the Pentagon restricting communication with Congress by military officials, including four-star generals, admirals, all the way up to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Essentially, this memo says that all Defense Department officials, including military officers, need to coordinate their communication with Congress through Hegseth's Office of Legislative Affairs. I'd encourage folks to go read our story because we go into great detail as to why that's a big potential problem. Just to give you a taste of it, lawmakers in the House and Senate and their staffs need to be able to communicate with combatant commands and other arms of the military when they're writing budgets, for example. They need answers to questions quickly, and I think the Office of Legislative Affairs is going to quickly be overrun with questions coming from Congress. For Hegseth critics, they say this is the latest in a string of initiatives to restrict the flow of information from the Pentagon. You have the new press restrictions, which we've covered in depth multiple times, and also the crackdown on military officials speaking at public think tank events. But look, we always want to be fair on the show, and I've actually got to give a lot of credit to Secretary Hegseth personally, and here's why. My colleague and friend of the show, Washington Times journalist Bill Gertz, is traveling with Hegseth right now in the Pacific as we record this. He's been all over the region with Hegseth on this trip, and the secretary has given Bill multiple in-person interviews. This is after, among other things, the Washington Times editorial board, for the record, wrote a piece dubbing Hegseth America's Secretary of Censorship. Even after that, he's still not only talking to the Washington Times, he's inviting one of our reporters to travel around the world with him on a plane and is giving that reporter, Bill Gertz, multiple exclusive interviews. I have to say, I'm pretty impressed by that. And I think it reflects very well on the secretary and his staff that they didn't just try to cut out the Washington Times entirely. Hopefully the next step, of course, is having Secretary Hegseth right here on the Threat Status Podcast. And we are joined now by retired Air Force Major General Charlie Dunlap, the executive director of the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security at Duke University Law School. He attained the rank of Major General during a 34-year career in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. General Dunlap also founded the Lawfire blog almost a decade ago, and I highly recommend that to all listeners. This is a resource that I rely on quite frequently. General, it's always great to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Ben, thank you very much for having me on the podcast, and you're really doing a great service here. It's providing a perspective that I think is vitally important these days, and count me as a regular listener.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Let's dive right into this. A lot of ground I want to cover with you here in 18 to 20 minutes, but let's start with this. We've seen a number of U.S. military strikes against these alleged drug boats off the coasts of the Americas and the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific recently. The Trump administration, of course, says these are narco terrorists carrying drugs bound for the U.S. and, we're essentially just blowing them up and killing people in the process to stop those drugs from reaching U.S. shores. Just this week, the latest strike saw multiple boats targeted and, according to the administration, 14 people killed. So I know this is a very big, overly broad question, but let's start here and then we can maybe dig a little deeper. General, are these strikes, are they legal from your point of view?
Ben, I don't think anybody can say whether they're legal or not, because it's a very, very fact-dependent question. And I think that the administration is doing itself a great disservice by not being very clear as to what their legal rationale would be. And the facts really do matter. It's one thing if, for example, if a drug boat was headed to the United States and there was no other way of stopping those drugs from getting to the U.S., there might be circumstances where the use of deadly force would be authorized. Even the International Committee of the Red Cross, they have a monograph about when law enforcement can use deadly force, assuming we're in a law enforcement modality. And they do talk about things like the defense of others, the prevention of perpetration of a very serious crime and to prevent the escape of people who are suspected of committing a very serious crime. But all this depends on information. And it may be that the government has information, perhaps signals intelligence. That I think the president indicated at one point that they heard them talking on one of these strikes. But we need a lot more information before anybody can make definitive claim one way or the other. I will say this: simply declaring a group a foreign terrorist organization is not alone sufficient to launch an attack against them. And keep in mind, we're talking about a couple of different legal regimes here. One is the law enforcement regime, which we've been under for several years. And Secretary Rubio said that only about 2% of the drugs are intercepted via the existing law enforcement effort. My own research into it indicates it's higher than that. And then there's more interceptions by the DEA and other law enforcement. But we're still talking about the overwhelming amount of drugs is going through, penetrating into the U.S., notwithstanding these heroic efforts by the Coast Guard and DEA and other law enforcement agencies. So you have the law enforcement legal regime. But then you have the legal regime that we've heard from the administration of a law of war regime. And that requires a number of prerequisites. Number one, we have to be in an armed conflict to use the law of armed conflict. And what we've been hearing is that the administration position is that it's a non-international armed conflict. In other words, an international armed conflict is between two countries. A non-international armed conflict is between a country and a group of non-state actors. Now, it doesn't include everybody who is a criminal or even criminal organizations. International law requires that there be sufficient organization of these non-state actors, as well as a certain intensity of the conflict. And here's where we get into some pretty complicated legal thoughts. Number one, are what we are undergoing an armed attack? Is this an armed conflict? I think a case could be made. We haven't really heard any details from the administration that drugs are in essence an arm. We do have a chemical weapons treaty, so the idea of chemicals being weaponized is not new. Some might say, well, wait a second, they're not trying to kill anybody. Maybe not, but they certainly are intending to harm people, especially with cocaine. They want to create addicts. And sadly, in this country, just for cocaine, I think there's something like 1.5 million addicts. So they are intending harm. Other people say, well, they don't have a political goal. International law doesn't require a political goal. It just requires this organization and intensity. So it would be helpful if the administration would tell us. Now, because it's not illogical for somebody to conclude from the absence of information that information doesn't exist. So I think it would behoove everybody. I understand and appreciate that to a certain extent you can't compromise sources and methods. But I think that there would be a way of more adequately presenting the government's case if they believe that a non-international armed conflict exists. And the legal matter is totally separate from the policy matter, because is this, as a matter of policy, the best way for the United States to address what is a very serious and tragic problem of drug abuse in this country? And I don't think, I am among those who would say that we're never going to fully stop the drug problem in the United States simply through military or even law enforcement means. We've got to do something on the demand side. And that's a whole different approach.
Well, let's go a step further, sort of, and this gets into a little bit of the theoretical realm. But as you know, there are rumblings, especially with the major U.S. military buildup in that region right now, that the administration could go beyond targeting alleged drug boats and potentially engage in military action in Venezuela, possibly even to topple the regime of President Nicolas Maduro. And just for context, listeners, I'm sure remember that during Mr. Trump's first term, We tried to oust Maduro by recognizing Juan Guaido as the rightful president of Venezuela, and that gambit, of course, didn't work, and Maduro is still there. But the legal justifications that you just very eloquently broke down, or the administration's attempt at legal justifications for these drug boat strikes, that the narco-terrorists are unlawful combatants and that we're engaged in combat with them, could that be extended to apply to a government as well? In this case, the Maduro government of Venezuela, or does that get into an entirely different legal conversation if we were to go there?
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. It involves another legal conversation, but I would say we don't have enough information as to what the Maduro government is doing and what their connection is with the drug cartels. And a tangential connection, in my judgment, would not be enough, and even accepting money from them and bribes and so forth. I think Congress needs to get involved with this before we do anything along that line. I believe that's qualitatively different than whatever might have been the justification, if there is one, for intercepting the drug boats. It's a whole different thing to launch a military action into a sovereign country without a firm, articulable, and defensible legal basis, which I have not heard yet.
Okay. Let's back this up to sort of the 30,000-foot point of view, because I'm curious, this is sort of the latest example of what's been a pattern of for 20 plus years now, administrations of both parties stretching legal bounds of military engagements in the post 9/11 era. I remember, I was thinking back to when you and I first met, I think about a decade ago, maybe even more now, during the Obama administration. And we were talking back then about whether current AUMFs, the authorizations for use of military force, could be stretched to apply to Syria or Libya. Is this current situation different than that? And does this differ, in your view, from past instances in which presidents Bush, Obama, Biden, even Trump previously in his first term have seemed to push the limits of legal authorities to conduct strikes against alleged terrorist targets abroad?
I think that there is a relationship there, Ben. And as you point out, when we were going to fight ISIS, when we began fighting ISIS, the AMF only talked about people who were involved in attacking us on 9/11, which was Al Qaeda. And you might remember back at that time, ISIS split off from Al Qaeda. They actually fought each other. But the conclusion was made, well, they're sort of after the same thing. Ergo, the AMF is sufficient to provide domestic legal justification along with the president's inherent Article 2 power with respect to being commander-in-chief of the armed forces, as well as the principal organ of foreign policy. But I would say that what we're seeing here is very problematic in that Congress is simply not getting involved the way it really needs to be. And I mean that in a very nonpartisan way. And I would suggest that both parties would be well served by having this discussion, and we need to have it now, because the way the domestic law, as well as impacting international law, domestic law is moving more and more into what's called the unitary executive theory, where the president, sometimes simply because Congress isn't acting, is filling the void. And I think that we need to rein that back in and reinvigorate the role of Congress in these very serious questions. And I'm not suggesting that the president should not have authority to react to what is truly an imminent threat. I think there's wide agreement on that. But what we're talking about here, for example, with something possible in Venezuela, is a whole different ballgame, because it's not just the law, it's the policy that Americans need to subscribe to in order to have, an understanding of what their military is being asked to do.
Well, you mentioned domestic issues, and I want to raise that now. It's the matter of domestic troop deployments here in the United States. There are, of course, any number of court cases on this, dealing with the use of National Guard troops in Oregon, Chicago, and elsewhere, to active duty troops in Los Angeles earlier this year, Guard forces in D.C., multiple lawsuits around all of those. There seem to be court rulings and appeals on an almost daily basis around all of this, and we don't have time to break all of them down individually. But broadly speaking, Has the president reached the limit or perhaps gone beyond the limit of what he can do in terms of domestic use of the United States military without going a step further and doing something like invoking the Insurrection Act?
Well, actually, the law is pretty, gives the president a lot of discretion. And I think that's understandable because when the laws were written, they wanted to make sure the president would have the authority based on, unpredictable things in the future. And we've now seen the president being involved in multiple litigation, as you point out, so we'll probably hear more. But I do think that we need to remember that the Posse Comitatus Act has, many exceptions beyond the Insurrection Act. I would hope that we would not be using the military so that we have to address these issues. That's a policy issue. But I think the way the cases are going, I would predict, especially if they get to the Supreme Court, that there's going to be a lot of deference to the president in determining whether or not these troop deployments are necessary. And I do think that even if they are, they're going to have to be very limited. And finally, just my own personal view, I don't agree with the policy of militarizing the whatever crime problem we have domestically in our cities. If we need more police, let's get more police. Let's let the military do what the military does. And we have enough to look at with Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. There's enough bad actors out there to keep the military fully occupied. If we need more federal marshals, let's recruit 50,000 more federal marshals. At least they will be civilian law enforcement people who are trained and focused for that particular kind of task. I also think that, we ought to look at other options like helping the state and local authorities. We're doing that with the Department of Education because I think the policy is that education can be better done on the local level. So we're moving resources that way. Maybe the same thing can be done with the issues in the city, the law enforcement issues in the city. But I am concerned about normalizing the use of the military for domestic security purposes. There isn't real good history examples around the globe for that. And in this country, it's just, there is no precedent for it. And I don't think it will end well. I don't think they'll be able to really accomplish what the president thinks they can accomplish because they're really not organized, trained, and equipped for law enforcement. But secondly, I'm afraid of the impact it might be on the public's perception of the military. And that's critically important so that we can continue to get the best and brightest coming into the armed forces to confront the very complicated and challenging bad actors out there who are, our potential adversaries.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point because you can look at any number of polls and survey data over the years. The military, of course, its approval rating is the highest among U.S. institutions. Something like ICE is significantly below that, according to polls that I've seen. And you don't want to have that gap sort of closing in the wrong direction, where all of a sudden the military starts to become unpopular because of its domestic law enforcement footprint. Last one, General, here, the Pentagon, under Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, has removed a number of legal officers inside the services. The Air Force and the Army's top judge advocates general were fired earlier this year. And, more recently, the Defense Secretary talked during his, controversial high-profile Quantico speech about rolling back things like the power of the Pentagon's Inspector General's office, potentially making it harder for complaints or legal actions to become hurdles to someone's career or their promotions. He directed the Pentagon to review the definition of things like bullying and hazing, toxic leadership. I'm just wondering, and not to sound conspiratorial here, but if there's a broader strategy at play around all of this. Do you have any sense of what you think this administration might be trying to do with respect to legal avenues and legal resources that exist inside the Pentagon and inside military services right now?
Ben, I won't try to speculate on what the Pentagon strategy is, but I will tell you this. I do think that there is an underappreciation of the role of law in warfighting. You know, law, if you look at the situation the Israelis have, they've lost the narrative because of these perceptions of illegalities and so forth, and it's had a strategic effect. People who think that law doesn't have any impact on warfighting are just mistaken because it does. Everything from having the individual soldier understand what he or she is being asked to do is lawful is a part of the intellectual preparation that warfighters need for that crucible of conflict so that when they're under that extreme stress, they will know that they are doing the right thing, but they have to know what the right thing is. And that's why I'm very disturbed that the Army has made law of armed conflict training optional. I can't imagine that that would be a good warfighting approach. It would be just the opposite. You ought to double down on it, given the way the world is today, instantaneous communications and so forth, and how damaging these incidents can be to an overall operation. We all remember Abu Ghraib. We all remember the My Lai massacre in Vietnam and how much they damaged the operation and the policy that the administrations at those times were trying to promote. So that's a key thing. And I also think there's a really fundamental misunderstanding of what judge advocates in particular do. In the military, it's even more important than other enterprises that you be surrounded by people who will tell you what you need to hear versus what you want to hear. You can mistake a can-do attitude that some officers believe that they always have to do. Can-do is fine as long as the do is legal, but somebody has to tell the principals when it is necessary that the right answer, that what they want to do is illegal or it needs to be done in a different way. I will say this about judge advocates, you have to learn a lot about the client, so to speak, which is the service or whatever warfighting. You have to know a lot about it so you can give advice that promotes what the commander wants to do in a legal way. And there are often, in my experience, many times when a commander wanted to do something, couldn't do it this particular way, but there was another way of accomplishing it within the law. So I think that there's an undervaluing of what the role of judge advocates and military lawyers in particular bring to the table when we're talking about warfighting. So I'm very concerned about that. The implication of the inference that people are drawing from some of these actions is really counterproductive to what I understand the secretary really wants to regenerate is a warfighting attitude. But warfighting includes honor. Warfighting includes doing the right thing. And JAGs can help that aim be accomplished through independent legal advice. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes it does require telling the chief, the boss, what he needs to, what he wants to do can't be done. But the value of hearing what you need to hear in complex, high-stress situations should not be undervalued.
Retired Air Force Major General Charlie Dunlap of the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security at Duke University School of Law. It's a pleasure talking to you as always, General. Thanks so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thank you, Ben.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where we identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all listen to the show. And my threat of the week is Hollywood, specifically in this case, the ways in which dramatized depictions of national security or military matters can create false perceptions of reality. Now, I should say right from the start here, maybe this is less of a threat and more of just a conversation starter. In this particular case, I'm referring to the Netflix movie A House of Dynamite, which is streaming now. I watched it. It's pretty good. I always love seeing Idris Elba on my screen, and he plays the president of the United States in this film. The long and short of it, spoilers coming alert, of course, on this. The long and short of it is, in the movie, Chicago is hit by a nuclear strike. The U.S. military is unable to shoot down a nuclear-armed missile fired at Chicago by an unknown adversary. In the movie, the U.S. tries to shoot down that missile with its ground-based mid-course defense missile system, GMD, but it misses, and Chicago, it's understood, though it's not shown on screen, is believed to have been destroyed. This sparked a direct response from the Missile Defense Agency at the Pentagon. Bloomberg got a hold of a memo from MDA, which said that, quote, the fictional interceptors in the movie missed their target, and we understand this is intended to be a compelling part of the drama intended for the entertainment of the audience, unquote. But the memo goes on to say the real world results, quote, tell a vastly different story, unquote. The memo basically argues that the GMD has a wildly high success rate and in reality would have taken out that missile. But then some researchers, including research director and senior scientist Laura Grego at the Union of Concerned Scientists, said it's virtually impossible to know how the GMD would perform during an actual attack, such as the one depicted in the film, because it's never been tested in that type of real-world, realistic scenario. So what is the truth on this? I don't know, and I guess nobody really does. But I do know this, if nothing else. This movie, A House of Dynamite, is a great advertisement for the Golden Dome missile shield, which we talk about all the time here in the show. If nothing else, it's kick-started a conversation about American missile defense strategy, and it's really interesting to me, and I think it's probably interesting to a lot of our listeners. So I'd encourage you, if you don't mind the spoiler that I just gave you, go watch the film, because if nothing else, it puts in perspective a dramatized version of why we need something like the Golden Dome in this country. We'll certainly be talking more about that in the weeks to come here on the show. So thanks to all of you for listening. A huge thanks to Charlie Dunlap from Duke University for coming on the show and explaining all of the legalities and questions around the U.S. strikes against alleged narco-terrorists. Guy Taylor will be back next week. In the meantime, please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all your friends. We'll be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.